There is a version of this story that you already know. A teacher, a shuttle, a January morning. 73 seconds. You probably remember where you were. Maybe you were a student. Maybe you were a teacher yourself. Maybe you were a parent who found out later that your kid had watched it at school without you there. Maybe you've just seen the documentaries because you hadn't been born yet. Or you've heard the stories from people older than you. But that image, the white plume splitting apart over a blue Florida sky, became one of the defining pictures of a generation. Most of us have carried it for 40 years. But here's what most people don't know. That moment was not the end of the story. It wasn't even close to the end. This podcast is about what came before and what came after. It's about a program that was never just about one flight, one teacher, or one morning in January. It's about an idea that refused to stay buried. My name is Sarah Bagby. I'm a historian and a former fourth grader who sat in Mrs. Troster's classroom the day the world changed. And this is The Mission Continues, the untold story of the Teacher in Space program. Now let's go back, not to 1986, to 1984. The Space Shuttle was flying, and I mean that in the most matter-of-fact way possible. It was flying regularly, multiple missions a year, crews going up, doing their jobs, coming home. By the standards of what NASA had achieved just 15 years earlier, landing a human on the surface of the moon, this was extraordinary. But here's the thing about extraordinary. Once those things become normal, they stop feeling extraordinary. Think about commercial aviation. The first time a person stepped into a plane, it was a miracle. By the time your parents were driving to the airport for Thanksgiving, it was a hassle. The miracle hadn't gone anywhere, but it had become routine, and routine does not make the front page. That was the shuttle's problem. Roger Lanius, who served as NASA's chief historian, has described the shuttle era as a transition from exploration spectacle to operational infrastructure. Apollo was exploration. It was going somewhere no one had ever been before. The shuttle was infrastructure, like a trucking company with a very expensive truck. It hauled satellites into orbit. It ran science experiments. It did important, useful work. But you don't hold your breath watching a truck. Howard McCurdy, who has written extensively about how Americans relate to space exploration, argues that public enthusiasm for spaceflight has always depended on narrative. We need a destination. We need a goal. We need something to root for. Apollo had the moon. The shuttle had a schedule. Now, some of those missions were genuinely remarkable. In 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. That mattered. It changed who Americans saw representing them beyond Earth. That same year, Guy Bluford became the first African-American astronaut to fly. In 1984, Kathy Sullivan became the first American woman to conduct a spacewalk. These were real missions, but once a barrier is broken, it's broken. The next mission doesn't carry the same electricity. And by the mid-1980s, not every launch made the front page. Not every mission interrupted regular television programming. Somewhere between the 15th and 20th shuttle flight, America had quietly started taking space for granted. Inside NASA, that was a problem, not just for morale, but for survival. The agency depended on Congress. Every year, appropriations committees decided how much money NASA got, and members of Congress paid attention to what their constituents cared about. When Americans were excited about space, funding was easier to justify. When interest faded, the questions got harder. Why were we spending this much? What are we getting for it? Couldn't that money go somewhere else? NASA needed people to care again. To understand what NASA was up against, you have to understand something about how the shuttle actually operated inside Washington. The shuttle wasn't just a spacecraft. It was a political object. Every seat on the mission carried weight. Who flew mattered, why they flew mattered, and who was watching mattered most of all. In April 1985, Senator Jake Garn of Utah flew aboard STS-51D. Now, Garn wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a pilot. He was a politician, specifically the chairman of the Senate subcommittee that oversaw NASA's budget. His flight was, in the most direct possible sense, a demonstration of institutional loyalty. You want our support? Here's how much we believe in you. We're getting on the rocket. Then, in January 1986, just weeks before Challenger, Senator Bill Nelson of Florida flew aboard STS-61C. Nelson represented a district that included Kennedy Space Center. NASA wasn't just his political interest, it was his economy. His constituents worked there. His identity was tied to it. His flight was a statement. I'm in this with you. These weren't random passengers who won a contest. They were people who controlled the money. And not everyone inside NASA was comfortable with that. Astronaut Mike Mullane spent years inside the shuttle program and later wrote one of the most candid accounts of what the world actually felt like from the inside. He described deep frustration among career astronauts toward what he called the part-timer program. These were men and women who had spent years, sometimes decades, training, waiting, competing for seats. And then they watched politicians and eventually civilians move to the front of the line. Mullane wrote that Garn and Nelson had committed the grievous sin of using their lawmaking clout to jump to the front of the line. And that's a pretty pointed thing to put in print. But here's the thing. Mullane also understood the reality. Civilian flights generated attention. Attention generated public support. Public support protected funding. And funding kept everyone employed and everyone flying. The machine needed fuel, and sometimes that fuel was a story. So when NASA started thinking about who else might fly, beyond politicians, beyond scientists, beyond test pilots, they were thinking about more than inspiration. They were thinking about survival. And Ronald Reagan was thinking about November. On the ground, something else was happening. The country was in a full-scale argument about schools. In April of 1983, the National Commission on Excellence in Education released a report called A Nation at Risk. If you were a teacher in that era, you probably remember it. If you were a parent, you probably heard about it. If you were a student, you probably felt its effects without knowing why. The report was blunt. It said American students were falling behind, not just behind their own previous performance, but behind students in other industrialized countries. It pointed to declining test scores. It flagged the rise of what it called a diluted curriculum, where students were taking easier courses and learning less. It noted that too many high school graduates were functionally illiterate when it came to science and mathematics. And then it said something that stopped the country cold. It said, quote, if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war, end quote. An act of war. That sentence was everywhere. Politicians cited it. Newspapers reprinted it. It showed up in campaign speeches and PTA meetings and Sunday sermons. It had the quality of a phrase that is too alarming to ignore and too memorable to forget. Now, educators had complicated feelings about the report. Some agreed that reforms were needed. Others thought the commission had oversimplified a deeply complex system and used alarming language to score political points. Barbara Morgan, who was teaching elementary school in McCall, Idaho, when the report came out, later recalled that it painted education with a very broad brush. Teachers were being described as part of a failing system, while simultaneously being told they were the solution to that system. It was a strange place to be. And the cultural atmosphere around teachers was genuinely difficult. There was a phrase that circulated widely in those years. You've probably heard it. Those who can do, those who can't teach. It was said as a joke. It was said as an insult. Either way, teachers heard it from neighbors, from in-laws, sometimes from the parents of the kids that were sitting in their own classrooms. It was a small thing, but small things accumulate, and the message underneath it was clear. Teaching wasn't a real profession. It was a consolation prize. So by 1984, you had a country that was genuinely worried about its schools, genuinely skeptical of its teachers, and genuinely uncertain about its future. The Cold War was still very much alive. The Soviet Union was still in the race, and the argument in A Nation at Risk and everywhere else was that America was falling behind not just in its classrooms, but in the global competition that those classrooms were supposed to prepare the next generation to win. That was the world that Ronald Reagan was governing in 1984. And 1984 was an election year. On August 27, 1984, Ronald Reagan stood before cameras and made an announcement that would set the next 2 years in motion. Let's be clear about that date. August 27th, 1984. The presidential election was November 6th, 1984. That was 10 weeks away. This is not a coincidence. Reagan's administration had spent 3 years at war with the educational establishment. He had campaigned on eliminating the Department of Education entirely, arguing it was federal overreach into a local matter. The National Education Association, the teachers' largest union in the country, had endorsed Walter Mondale, Reagan's opponent. Teachers as an organized political force were not Reagan voters. They were not Reagan allies. They were in many respects his opponents. So what Reagan did on August 27th wasn't tactically elegant. He didn't go to the union. He went around it. He didn't elevate teachers as a political constituency. He elevated one teacher as a national symbol. A specific, relatable, photogenic, individual classroom teacher who had nothing to do with collective bargaining or educational policy or any of the institutional fights his administration had been losing in academic circles. I am directing NASA, he said, to begin a search in all of our elementary and secondary schools and to choose as its first private citizen passenger in the history of our space program one of America's finest, a teacher. It was a masterpiece of political reframing. In a single sentence, he separated the profession from its politics. He honored the individual while continuing to undermine the institution, and he did it 10 weeks before an election, in front of cameras, with the full weight of the presidency behind it. The National Education Association was not fooled. They had concerns, publicly stated, about whether this was genuine investment in education or a made-for-television gesture that would generate coverage and change nothing in actual classrooms or actual education budgets. They'd watched this administration cut federal education spending. They'd watched the rhetoric about excellence in education come without the funding that excellence requires. Nice words about teachers were not new. This administration had plenty of those. But here's the thing about political gestures that are also genuinely good ideas. They can be both things at once. Reagan's motives were transparently electoral, and the program he announced was real. 11,000 teachers applied. 114 of them traveled to Washington. Barbara Morgan spent a week in that room and described it as one of the most remarkable experiences of her professional life. The educational mission NASA embedded in the program, connecting students to science, elevating the teaching profession in the public eye, building a national network of space ambassadors was substantive. You can believe Reagan used teachers as props for a campaign and also believe that what happened next mattered. Both are true. The cynicism of the origin does not erase the significance of what followed. But we should not pretend the origin wasn't cynical. The date is right there. And more than 11,000 teachers applied. 11,000. That number changed the conversation. This wasn't a cynical stunt if 11,000 professionals raised their hands and said, I want to do this. This was something that had tapped into something real, a desire for recognition, a desire to matter in a larger story, a desire to carry the classroom where it had never been. From those 11,000 applications, the process narrowed. State education agencies reviewed submissions and selected 2 nominees from each state, each territory, and several federal agencies. 114 teachers were chosen to travel to Washington, D.C. for a week-long conference in late June 1985. Imagine that room. 114 teachers from across the country. Elementary school teachers, high school teachers, teachers from rural Idaho and urban New York and suburban Ohio and the beaches of Florida. Science teachers, social studies teachers, English teachers, math teachers. Different in almost every way, all there for the same reason. Barbara Morgan was one of them. She was teaching at an elementary school in McCall, Idaho, a small mountain town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the idea of going to space feels very far away. She described that week as electric, not because everyone was competing, but because everyone understood they were representing something larger than themselves. These weren't just 114 individuals who wanted to go to space. They were 114 teachers who had been chosen from 11,000 to stand in for every educator in the country. The selection panel evaluated them on essays, medical fitness, in a detail that reveals exactly what kind of program this was, whether the judges would like to see this person on the cover of Time and on the Today Show as well. This was not purely a scientific selection. It was a media selection. NASA needed someone who could do the educational work and carry the story. Both things had to be true. The 114 were narrowed to 10 finalists who traveled to Houston for medical evaluations, additional interviews, and familiarization with shuttle operations. And from those 10, NASA would select one primary participant and one backup. On June 26, 1985, President Reagan addressed the finalists directly at the White House. Not in a press release, not through a surrogate, in person. He told them that teaching was a profession that molds the future. He told them that being selected as a finalist was a demonstration of excellence. He told them that students across the country were watching. That last part mattered more than it might seem, because for years teachers have been told that the country was watching and finding them wanting. A nation at risk had been the national verdict, not good enough. Now the President of the United States was standing in front of 100 teachers and saying the opposite. You represent the nation. The shift in tone was real, and it filtered outward. Newspapers ran profiles of finalists. Morning television shows invited them to talk about the lesson plans they might one day teach from orbit. Small town papers ran front page stories about our teacher who might be going to space. The program wasn't just changing how the country thought about space. It was changing how the country thought about teachers. Howard McCurdy has written that American spaceflight depends on symbolic figures, that we turn complex systems into human stories because human stories are how we understand the world. The Teacher in Space program was betting everything on that. Find the right person, tell the right story, and the whole country will lean in. They were about to find out if they were right. Next time on The Mission Continues, a name is announced, a symbol is born, schools start planning around a launch date, and 73 seconds will change everything. I'm Sarah Bagby. Thanks for listening.